You don't know what's possible. And you're not as much as you could be. And so God only knows what you could do and have and give if you sacrificed everything to it. And that's the reason Abraham is constantly making sacrifices. It's archaic, right? He's burning up like baby lambs, but like, well, they're alive, you know, that's something, and they're valuable, and that's something. You have to admit, even if you think about it as a modern person, that the act of sacrificing something might have some dramatic compulsion to it, you know, to go out into a flock and to take something that's newborn and to cut its throat and to bleed it and to burn it. Might be a way of indicating to yourself that you're actually serious about something. And it isn't so obvious that we have rituals of seriousness like that now. And so it's not so obvious that we're actually serious about anything. And so maybe that's not such a good thing. And so maybe we shouldn't be thinking that these people were so archaic and primitive and superstitious. It's possible that they knew something that we don't. And certainly in the Abrahamic stories, one of the things that maintains Abraham's covenant with God is his continual willingness to sacrifice. And it's so that sacrificial issue is so important, because you are not committed to something unless you're willing to sacrifice for it. Commitment and sacrifice are the same thing. And I think it borders on miraculous that those concepts are embedded into this narrative at the level of dramatic action, you know, instead of abstract explanation. People are acting this out, and the fundamental conception is so profound that it's really quite awe-inspiring. It's breathtaking, really, when you understand what message is trying to be conveyed. You have to make sacrifices, and what do you have to sacrifice? You have to sacrifice that which is most valuable to you currently that's stopping you. And God only knows what that is. It's certainly the worst of you. It's certainly that. And God only knows to what degree you're in love with the worst of you. So you move from the unbearable present to the ideal future. And you can't help that. You have to live in a structure like that. That's your house. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you want to get your house in order, and if you want it to be a place that you can live properly, then you have to plan the future that is perfect. And then I think, well, what does that mean? And it means it's good for you, right? And one of the things that I do all the time with my clinical and consulting clients is try to figure out what would be good for them. But we do more than that. We try to think, okay, well, how can we set this up so it's really good for you, and that all the side consequences of that are things that are good for other people. And so, because people are often also timid about trying to get something that's good for themselves because they feel that it's selfish or that they don't deserve it. So we set it up so that, well, look, we're going to set it up so that it's plainly obvious that this will not harm the structure of the universe. For you to have what you need and to do it in a way that's of benefit to other people. There's no downside to that. And so it's okay. It's okay if you reach out and take that. And one of the things that's interesting about the biblical stories, the Abrahamic stories as well, is that God doesn't really seem to be opposed to the success of the people that he's chosen. You know, what happens to them is as they progress through their journey is they get larger flocks, and they get more authority, and they get life more abundant. That's what happens. God doesn't seem to be a miser in the Old Testament. It's like if you put in the effort and you accept the covenant and you make the sacrifices, then you get to be successful, and maybe successful beyond your wildest dreams. And that's actually seems to be okay with God, and that's pretty cool, given that, you know, that general notion of. But again, it seems to me that that's very good news, and that you also don't have to be perfect in order to have that happen. And then the other thing, this is the issue about going into the unknown. It's like, well, if you leave your country and your kin and your father's house, and you go out into a land that your intuition guides you to, you're going to undergo these radical transformations. This is a sacrificial transformation too, because you're moving forthrightly and voluntarily into chaos, right? And that's the same as the dragon fight. That's the hero's story. And what will happen there is that you will transform yourself. And so the call to an ideal is also the call to a sequence of deaths and rebirths that move you closer and closer to the ideal.
Part of spiritual development is to recognize the satanic tendencies that characterize you, and to fully wrestle with them, and to integrate them. That's the thing. It's not so much to cast them away, it's to transmute them You know, and you can see the difference between people who've done that and people who haven't, at least to some degree, because people who haven't integrated the shadow at all are naive. And you can tell that when you look at them, and you can tell that when you talk to them. And because they're naive, they're often resentful as well because they get taken advantage of. And someone who's integrated that more, they're dangerous in the martial arts sort of way, which is they're dangerous, but they don't have to use it because their presence radiates implicit potential for havoc, and that's really necessary. It's one of the things that gives people self-respect. You most want to find will be found where you least want to look. There's this old story that's from King Arthur, and King Arthur has these knights, right? They all sit around a round table, which means they're roughly equal. That's what the round table means. And they're off to find the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is the most valuable object. That's what it means. So they're off to find the most valuable thing, but they don't know what it is, and they don't know where it is. But they know that there's a most valuable thing, so in some sense it's akin to them orienting themselves by the star. And they don't know where to look, and so what they decide is they have the castle, and it's the middle of a forest, and so each knight decides to start looking for the Holy Grail by entering the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And so what's the idea there? Well, imagine there are things that come easy to you, and that you're fond of pursuing, and that you're happy about pursuing. So you've found those and pursued them, and you've mastered them. So you know all that, but then there's another place that you don't want to go. And so you haven't gone there, and you haven't mastered it, and you're very small in comparison to it because you haven't mastered it, and so it has this monstrous aspect. If what you're doing isn't working, it's where you haven't gone that you need to go. And so I can give you another example of this. So let's say you're an agreeable person, and so you don't like conflict, and you won't stand up for yourself, and you regard anger and the proclivity to provoke and to engage in conflict as something that's positively terrible. It's not only that you're not good at it, it's actually that it's wrong. So that's where you have to go if you're going to learn how to stand up for yourself. And imagine that you're afraid. Maybe you have something like agoraphobia. And so there's a whole bunch of things that you're afraid of, and you don't want to go there. But if you want to put yourself together, then that's exactly where you have to go. And so it's frequently the case that what you want to find is to be found where you least want to find it. And that idea is echoed in the prominent stories of dragons and gold. It's exactly the same idea. The dragon is this terrible thing. It's this terrible predatory thing that lives forever and is very, very wise. And it lives underground, and it'll kill you. It'll burn you up in a second. But it hoards gold. And so you have to go there into the dragon's lair if you're going to get the gold. And that's a representation of people's paradoxical relationship with reality. It's like you have to go out there and confront it in order to incorporate what it has to offer to you. But the probability that that's going to be intensely dangerous and push you right to the limit, first of all, those are actually the same thing. If it didn't push you to the limit, you wouldn't gain anything valuable from it. So you don't get one without the other. You don't get the gold without the dragon. That's a very strange, very, very strange idea. But it seems to be accurate. So all of that's lurking underneath this, in this imagery of the whale. Now, the whale, you can think of the story of Jonah. What happens with Jonah is that, roughly speaking, he's a prophet, and God tells him that he has to go to this city and straighten it out because it's veered off the path and it's heading towards doom. And Jonah thinks, I'm not going to that city to tell those people anything like that because they're not going to be very happy with me just showing up there and telling them, everything they're doing wrong. And so he hops on a boat and tries to get out of there. And then God conjures up this huge storm, and the boat is about to be swamped. And Jonah admits that it's actually his fault because God's upset with him because he got this direct command to go straighten out the city, and he ran off. And so they're not happy about this, but they throw Jonah overboard, and the sea's calm, and a great fish comes up, a whale, and swallows him. And then he's down in the fish for 3 days, and it throws him up on the dry land, and then he's learned his lesson by that time, and he goes off to pursue his proper destiny. So that's echoed in this story as well, that if you don't follow the pathway that you're supposed to follow, the seas will become stormy for you, and something will come up and pull you down, and you'll be in a terrible place for some length of time till you learn your lesson. And if you're lucky, you'll get spit back up on shore, and then you can go do what you should do. Well, I mean, that's not a lesson that anybody needs to have interpreted. I think everybody understands that.
What steps should someone take to start developing delayed gratification when they constantly give in to instant gratification?
Well, okay, imagine, I know the answer to this to some real degree, because I had graduate students in particular who I picked because they were very smart and often very creative, but sometimes they weren't very conscientious. So they had a hard time delaying gratification. And so, well, I would say, if you would like to discipline yourself, which is a very good idea, you need to pick a direction. Pick a direction you want to go first. Pick a goal you would like to attain, and a medium to long-term goal. You might imagine something you need and want, some attainment that would motivate, whose pursuit would motivate you. And you can ask yourself that. It's a good question to ask yourself in general, you know. This is a very good question to ask yourself, is if you could have what you needed and wanted, what would that be? And that's a meditative question. You don't want to force an answer out of yourself. You want to ask yourself that like you would ask someone else. If I could have what I wanted, what would that look like? And you can ask yourself that in a more differentiated way. If I could have the relationship that I needed and wanted, if I could have the friendships, if I could have the job or career, if I could have the educational pathway, if I could adopt civic responsibility in an optimized manner, if I could engage in some creative enterprise, if I took care of myself properly, if I regulated my susceptibility to temptations, what would that look like if it was optimized? And then that sets you up a goal that has some motivational force. This is worth doing. And then you might find, well, you don't do it anyways. And then I would say, well, that's because you're biting off more than you can chew. The next goal is to take your goal and to fragment it into micro goals until you find a micro goal that's small enough that it still presents some challenge that you will do. And so I've become, one of the things I'm known for, I suppose, is my advice to people to clean up their rooms. And the people who think I'm their enemy laugh about that rule because of its simplicity, let's say. But the only reason they think it's simple is because they've never tried it. It's actually extremely difficult. And it was very frequently the case that, well, it's very difficult to put your room, your office, your bedroom in order. I mean, you think about your bedroom, hypothetically, let's say you're married, you share that room with someone else. Is your bedroom in order? Really? And I don't just mean, is it neat? Maybe it's too neat. Maybe it's too orderly. Maybe it's too sterile. Maybe it's too bare. Maybe that characterizes your whole bloody relationship. Maybe, really? And maybe that is genuinely reflected in the state of your room, because it's very probable that that room is a microcosm of your marriage. It's highly probable. And so what that would mean is to organize that room would require the organization of your marital life, not least because if you want to put that room in order, you're going to have to negotiate with your wife about how that's going to be done. And while you're making that negotiation, even in relationship to the micro details, you're going to encounter almost everything that's wrong with your relationship. And so you might ask yourself when you walk into your bedroom, I hate this bedroom. It's like, you should really think that through. And then you need to think through what you would need to do so that you love that room, or even more complexly, so that you both loved it, because that's a tough thing to attain, boy, because you're going to have differences in taste, you're going to have differences in orderliness. There's all sorts of things that you're going to have to negotiate in order to make that room you both inhabit jointly desirable. Anyways, you
Set yourself a goal. Ask yourself what goal you want to set. And then break the goal down into steps that are small enough so that even someone as pathetic as you could manage them. And that requires a tremendous humility. I know it was frequently the case, for example, with my clients, that I would do an analysis of their situation in life, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, that someone was 30, living at home, in the bedroom they grew up in high school, in a complete bloody state of disorder, both moral and practical. And one of the relatively simple steps that we might agree upon with regards to moving forward is the person might think, well, you know, I'm 30, I'm really immature, I haven't taken any responsibility for my life, my mother still makes my bed and cleans up after me. It's like, well, why don't you just start with that? You know, because you're not going to just fix your life. Why don't you just try to clean up your room like you're a mature 14-year-old instead of a dreadfully dismal 30-year-old. And so, first of all, it's really hard for someone, even if they're desperate, to admit that that's necessary, right? Because it's so bloody humiliating. You mean, really, I'm so damn useless that my basic goal is going to be to clean up my bedroom? It's like, well, looks like it. And actually, it's worse than that, because then you ask the person, you negotiate with the person, they say, well, I'll try to clean up my room. Then they come back the next week and they say, I had one client, this was so funny, he's going to vacuum his rug. That was his goal for the week. He just had a child out of wedlock, and he was afraid that he was going to be a very bad father, which was a very realistic fear. And so he wanted to put himself together, you know, and so that's why he came to see me. And he lived in this squalor, and one thing we decided to do was that he could vacuum the rug, which he hadn't done for like 12 years because his mother would do it. And so it was so funny, it's so unbelievably comical. He went and got the vacuum, a stand-up vacuum, an upright vacuum, and he brought it into his room, but he didn't bring it all the way in. He put it in the doorway, leaning like this across the doorway. And then instead of vacuuming his room, he stepped over that bloody vacuum cleaner for a whole week and then came and told me that he couldn't do it. It's like, it's not surprising to me at all, because you think, well, that's such a trivial thing. It's like, if it was such a trivial thing, he'd have a clean room. It's not trivial at all. That chaos in his immediate environment was deeply emblematic of the chaos of his life. They were the same thing. And so for him to even begin the process of bringing order to chaos, which is a divine process, by the way, and the highest moral requirement, he had to be willing to face the catastrophe, the chaotic catastrophe of his life. And he hadn't done that for like 30 years. Why was he going to start that week? Just because he said he was going to? It's like, good luck. So what you do as a therapist in that situation is you just make the task smaller until you find a task so small, but still moving forward, that the person will do. So I might have said, I don't remember the particulars of the situation, I might have said, well, do you think you can get that vacuum cleaner, do you think you could move it out of the doorway into your room? That's all you have to do this week. Do you think you can do that? And I'd say that and offer that without being contemptuous. Like, you have to be very careful about such things. And I know that this is more complicated than it looks. And I also know that the first step taken towards the domination of chaos and its transformation into order is a cardinal and difficult step. And so you can make it small, and that's fine, it'll still work. So I might say, well, just move the vacuum cleaner inside your room. And then I would also say to someone in that situation, don't do more than that. If the agreement that you've made with me and with yourself is that that's enough, abide by the contract that you've written with yourself, and allow yourself to be grateful for the fact that you had the courage to take even a single step forward. And don't push your bloody luck, because maybe you'll have a brief fit and vacuum the whole rug, and then you'll be so annoyed at how you've destabilized your entire life that you'll redouble your attempts to make a mess, and the place will be more like hell than ever for 2 months. It's very probable that that sort of thing will occur if you break the contract you've set with yourself. The upside of this is, because you think, oh my God, that's so dismal, I have to start that low. It's like, yeah, probably, especially if it's a real difficult thing you're trying to sort out. You have to start as low as you are useless, and that's low. So, but the upside is that progress accelerates. It's not linear, and so if you take once you take the first step, the probability that you'll take a slightly larger second step increases, and that increases non-linearly. And so once you get the ball rolling, so to speak, once you start pushing the rock uphill, you can do it faster and faster. And so even if you have to start in a very humiliating manner, that doesn't mean that's where you'll end. One of the things that Tammy and I learned to do, and this was a consequence of me being trained as a behavior therapist, is, we'll just take an example that maybe I was trying to learn how to compliment her when she dressed nicely. And maybe the fact that I wasn't good at that was manifest in the fact that she'd put some effort into her dress, and then I wouldn't respond in the appropriate manner, and that would dishearten her. And I don't particularly remember that exactly happening, but it'll be a perfectly reasonable example. And so then she would be displeased. And then the question would be, well, is she displeased because I'm too stupid to offer a proper compliment? Or is she displeased because she's so needy and lacking confidence that she needs a compliment that would go beyond the ordinary? And the answer is, what the hell do we know? Could be one or the other or both. And so what's a possible solution to that? And one possible solution would be, okay, if you do put some effort into your appearance, or I do, we could reverse the situation, but if you put some effort into your appearance, and you would like to hear from me exactly the words that would reward you for doing that and provide you with the confidence to attempt it again in the future, what would those words be?
You look good without a beard, dear.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Very funny. Very funny. And then you can say, well, if you tell me those words, I will repeat them back to you. And then the person who needs the words might object, well, that's false, it's superficial, it's artificial, it's not spontaneous. And if you really loved me, I wouldn't have to tell you what to say. It's like, well, all of that's wrong. It's like, just because I love you doesn't mean I'm not stupid. And so, in fact, I love you might even be evidence that I am, in fact, stupid. So like, help me out here. I don't know what you want, and maybe you could just tell me, and then I'll tell you what you want, and I'll do it stupidly and badly. But I'll be slightly better at it the next time, and maybe if you let me practice 50 times stupidly and badly, I'll get reasonably good at it, and then that's something that we'll be both good at for the rest of our lives. And that's something worth knowing. If you imagine you're upset with your partner because they haven't delivered something to you, whatever it is that you want, and then there's two questions that arises, right? Are you just like immature and greedy and self-centered, or are they useless and incapable of delivering? And neither of you know, and you have to sort that out. And then you also, as the injured party, let's say, might regard it as a moral necessity on your part to indicate to your partner exactly what you want, is to tell them. Like, it looks to me like if you did this or said this, then that would satisfy me. And then you might say, well, is that reasonable? Do you feel that it would be reasonable for you to offer that? Would you be willing to offer that? Am I pushing you too far? Those are all things that have to be sorted out. And then you can practice that, and you can practice that with the resolution of every dispute that emerges. If you're willing to take to yourself the responsibility of communicating to your partner your conditions for satisfaction. It means you have to admit them to yourself too, which is also very difficult. And then you can help your partner take stupid incremental steps forward, in the direction that you'd like to see expand, and then you can get better at that. It's unbelievably useful. You can get better at how you have dinner together or breakfast or lunch. Those things repeat every day, so they're very important. You can get better at how you greet each other when you come home. You can get better at the routine that you fall into, let's say, when you go to bed at night or when you wake up in the morning. All these things that repeat, you know, because that's your life, the things that repeat. You can conceptualize how you might like them to be ordered if they were undertaken in an optimal manner, and you can start incrementally moving forward to that. And you can do that by communicating what you need and want, and by carefully rewarding your partner for taking the appropriate incremental steps forward. And so if you're trying to discipline yourself, you make a goal, you break it down into micro goals, and you implement the micro goals and reward yourself for doing so. And if you do that reliably and you make that a practice, that you'll become more disciplined across time, and you'll move towards the fulfillment of your goals. And that's practically how that's the practical guide for success on that front.
What's the keys to building confidence so that you're attracting what you want?
Look, I read some of your biographical history before we talked today, and you tell a story about being picked last. And then you compensated for that.
Yes.
Now, Alfred Adler, by the way, the psychoanalyst, the associate of Freud, built his whole theory around compensation of that sort. Inferiority complex plus compensation. But it's adaptive, right? Like, you got picked last, it embarrassed the hell out of you.
Yep.
So what did? You decided that is not going to be me
Never
anymore.
again.
Right.
Never again.
Okay,
Yes.
now you did say, you know, that you adopted a maybe too inflexible model of what it meant to be masculine as a consequence. But when I read that, I thought, yeah, but still, fair enough. It wasn't the new you that you adopted wasn't optimal in all possible manners, but it was definitely improvement over the previous you.
Exactly. I wasn't picked last again, that's for sure.
Right. Well, exactly. Okay. So the first thing I would say is that if you feel insecure and less and ashamed and all of that you have to take stock. And look, I have an exercise online at selfauthoring.com. There's 3 exercises there. One helps you write about the past, one about the present, and one about the future. The present authoring program helps you assess your faults and your virtues. Okay, well, if you have some faults and you feel insecure and inferior because of that, well, you should. Now, it shouldn't be so much that you're crippled by it and unable to take action. You shouldn't be beating yourself into the ground because you're not everything you could be, because no one is. And if you beat yourself into the ground, then you can't get up and improve. But you have to differentiate. It's like, okay, to what degree am I being hard on myself, counterproductively critical, hearing the voice of my too harsh and angry father in my head,
Right.
Adopting inappropriate stereotypical representations of masculine competence? How much of my self-criticism is ill-advised? Fair enough. And you want to deal with yourself with a certain amount of care. But then along with that, there's fix your weaknesses. You know, if you're ashamed of being ignorant, you're showing up at a party because, you know, you claim to knowledge that you don't have and someone exposes you. Well, you can be angry at them, and you probably will, but they've actually done you a favor. They pointed out an inadequacy is a pathway that you can travel down, right? A recognized inadequacy is, it's such a gift in some sense, if it's accurate. I'm in it, because you think, well, what should I do? What should I do with my life? That's a real complicated question. Oh, here's an inadequacy. Excellent, you have a goal now, rectify it. Now, you still have to think strategically and figure out how to rectify it and do it step by step. But Carl Rogers, the psychotherapist, pointed out that the person, for therapy to be successful, the person has to want to change. So they have to have recognized that they have a problem. If someone is mandated by the court to attend therapy, it's very difficult for the therapist to convince them that they have a problem. Once you're convinced you have a problem, it's like, away you go. You know, I know it's still technically difficult. It requires discipline and all of that. There's no magic solution, but If you're plagued by feelings of inferiority, you should rectify the most obvious inferiorities. I would say that you have to rectify an inadequacy when it's clearly an impediment to your goal, or you have to shift goals. But if you're shifting goals because of an inadequacy related impediment, then you have to ask yourself, is your desire to shift the goal reliable, or are you just taking the easy way out? You can protect yourself by picking a different goal that's more difficult. That's a good mental hygiene practice, because sometimes you should switch goals rather than rectifying inadequacies. But you can fool yourself then, and that's not good.
And if someone is goalless, lazy, unmotivated, not sure what they want to do, what would be a few key steps to get started to turn their life around, or to find the motivation for something greater than where they're at?
Well, I think a fair bit of that's probably to be found in, you can find it in shame, you can find it in guilt, you can find it in conscience, you can find it in anger, you can find it in interest and engagement and beauty. There's lots of pathways. If you're angry about something in the world, well, that's an indication that that's in some sense your problem, right? It's speaking to you in a moral sense. This shouldn't be that way. Well, maybe you're the person who should do something about it in some manner. Maybe it'll take your whole life to figure out how to do that. But it's bothering you for a reason. So the negative emotions can be a pathway to transformation. I'm not trying to romanticize them. They can crush you completely and leave you with nothing, right? For sure. And they can go badly astray. But shame, that's a good one. What am I ashamed of? Well, can you fix any of that? I'm going to work on these things that I'm ashamed of, and just see, like, does my life improve enough so that I'm not so bitter about it now, or I'm not so hopeless about it now? And my experience has generally been that works. It works. And then some of it's practical knowledge too. It's like you can get a really long way with very small changes, incremental changes, micro habit changes. So aim low.
Don't have big goals or big transformations.
Well, you can, but the problem with a big goal is that it's daunting enough so that it might paralyze you, and there's a high probability of failure. And so imagine that you're your own child. Okay, now imagine you love this child and you would like him, we'll say him because it's you and I talking, to succeed. Now you have an ideal for this child. You would like him to grow up to be the best he can be, better than you, the best man he can be. That's what you want for your son, if the good part of you is talking.
Yeah.
You definitely want him to be better than you are, but you want him to be the best he could be if your vision is unclouded. Okay, but then you offer him a goal. It's like, well, do this. Well, can he do it? Well, if he can do it without a second's thought, there's no challenge in it. There's no developmental impetus. It's not in the zone of proximal development. You want a goal that you can do, but that requires some improvement on your part. Because you want to attain the goal, that's satisfying, but then you want to make yourself into the thing that can attain goals. And so you want to push yourself.
Yeah.
You want to push yourself a bit far.
Yeah.
Yes. And there's an ample psychological literature that suggests that that's where maximal motivation is to be found.
Interesting.
So you're pursuing a goal, but you're also pursuing the goal of transforming yourself at the same time. You're doing both of those at the same time.
Do you need to know that you're transforming yourself in order to attain the goal? Or do most people just think, I got to take these steps to make it happen, but they don't realize they're becoming better human beings?
It depends on what you mean by realize. They have the sense of satisfaction and confidence that would indicate that, although they might not be able to make what that means explicit. But I would say it would be better to make it explicit. It adds one other dimension of possible motivation. I still believe that, genuine accomplishment, but it's ethical. It's always ethical accomplishment. I believe that to be the case. Genuine ethical accomplishment is the best source of security, but it's not unerring.
When you mean ethical accomplishment, do you mean
Doing something good, right.
whether people know about it or not, just good and right for yourself? Is that what I'm hearing you say? Or does someone else need to acknowledge that this was good and right?
I think if you've done it for yourself, that's good. But if you do it and other people are in on it and along for the ride, that's also good. And sometimes that's better to bring people along. If it's just a matter of them acknowledging it, well, there's value in that too. I mean, people say, well, you shouldn't care what people think of you. It's like, well, yeah, of course you should. Psychopaths don't care what people think of them. Now, you shouldn't care so much what people think about you that you're willing to lie to maintain whatever it is that you think they value. Like, there are places beyond which that becomes counterproductive, clearly. There's this old story in King Arthur where the knights go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is either the cup that Christ drank out of at the Last Supper or the cup into which the blood that gushed from his side was poured when he was crucified. The stories vary, but it's basically a holy object, like the phoenix in some sense, that's a representation of transformation. So it's an ideal, and so King Arthur's knights, who sit at a round table because they're all roughly equal, go off to find the most valuable thing. And where do you look for the most valuable thing when you don't know where it is? Well, each of the knights looks at the forest surrounding the castle and enters the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's a good thing to understand, because the gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. And that's why there's an idiosyncratic element of it for everyone. Your particular place of enlightenment and terror is not going to be the same as yours, except that they're both places of enlightenment and terror. So they're equivalent at one level of analysis and different at another. So anyways, back to fiction and what it does. It distills truth, and it produces characters that are composites. And the more they become composites, the more they approximate a mythological character. And so they become more and more universally true and more approximating religious deities. But the problem with that is they become more and more distant from individual experience. And so with literature, there's this very tight line where you need to make the character more than merely human, but not so much of a god that, one of the things that happened to Superman in the 1980s, Superman started out, he's got a heavenly set of parents, by the way, and an earthly set of parents, and he's an orphan like Harry Potter. Very common theme is that when Superman first emerged, he could only jump over buildings, and maybe he could stop a locomotive. But by the time the 1980s rolled around, like, he could juggle planets and, swallow hydrogen bombs, and, he could do anything. Well, people stopped buying the Superman comics because how interesting is that? It's like something horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And something else horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And it's like, that's dull. He turned into such an archetype. He was basically the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God, and that's no fun. It's like God wins, and then God wins again, and then again God wins, and so then they had to weaken him in different ways with kryptonite. So green kryptonite kind of made him sick, and red kryptonite, I think, kind of mutated him, if I remember correctly. And anyways, they had to introduce flaws into his character so that there could be some damn plot. And that's something to think about. There's a deep existential lesson in that your being is limited and flawed and fragile. You're like the genie, which is genius in the little tiny lamp, you know, this immense potential, but constrained in this tiny little living space, as Robin Williams said when he played the genie in Aladdin. But the fact that you have limitations means that the plot of your life is the overcoming of those limitations, and that if you didn't have limitations, well, there wouldn't be a plot, and maybe there would be no life. And so that's part of the reason why perhaps you have to accept the fact that you're flawed and insufficient, and live with it and consider it a precondition for being. It's at least a reasonable idea. So anyways, one of the main characters is the country, the known, the explored territory. We went over that a bit, and it always has two elements. I mean, your country is your greatest friend and your worst enemy, you know, because it squashes you into conformity and demands that you act in a certain manner, and reduces your individuality to that element that's tolerated by everyone else, and it constrains your potential in a single direction. And so it's really tyrannical, but at the same time it provides you with a place to be and all of the benefits that have accrued as a result of the actions of your ancestors and all the other people that you're associated with. So there's the good tyrant, or the bad tyrant, and the good king, and those are archetypal figures, and that's because they're always true, and they're always true simultaneously, you know, which is partly why I object to the notion of the patriarchy, because it's a it's the what do you call that? It's the apprehension of a mythological trope, which is that of the evil tyrant, without any appreciation for the fact that the archetype actually has two parts, and the other part is the wise king. And you know, you can tell an evil tyrant story about culture, no problem, but it's one-sided, and that's very dangerous, because you don't want to forget all the good things that you have while you're criticizing all the ways that things are in error. That's a lack of gratitude, and it's a lack of wisdom, and it's founded in resentment, and it's very dangerous, both personally and socially. I told you that Captain Hook is a tyrant because he's got this crocodile chasing him, and the crocodile has a clock in its stomach, and that's death. It's like, obviously, right? Tick, 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 tick. And it's a crocodile, and it's under the water, and it's already got a taste of him, so he's being chased around by death, and that makes him terrified and resentful and cruel and bitter, and so he's a tyrant. And he wants to wreak havoc everywhere. And then Peter Pan, of course, looks at Captain Hook and thinks, why the hell should I grow up and to be a tyrant and sacrifice all the potential of childhood? And the answer to that is, the potential sacrifices itself if you don't utilize it as you mature, and you just end up a 40-year-old lost boy, which is a horrifying thing to behold. It's almost as if you're the corpse of a child, the living corpse of a child, because who the hell wants a 6-year-old, 40-year-old? You're a little on the stale side by that point, and not the world's happiest individual. So, you know, your potential is going to disappear because you age anyways, and so you might as well shape that potential in a particular direction and at least become something, no matter how limited, rather than nothing. So, you know, Peter Pan, that's a great story. It's a great mythological story. So, well, so let's talk about tyrants. Well, not only are they mythological figures, but they exist, and they tend to be deified. I mean, Stalin was, for all intents and purposes, God the Father in Soviet Russia, although he was pretty much only the worst elements of Old Testament God, who was, you know, constantly smiting people and wiping out populations and doing all sorts of things that seemed to be quite nasty. But nonetheless, you know, people worshipped him in many ways, and he's a representation of just exactly what goes wrong when things really go wrong, when people stop paying attention and when they all lie. Because one of the things that characterized the communist state was that no one ever got to say anything they actually believed, ever. And that was partly because 1 out of 3 people was an informer, which meant if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of them were informing on the government about you, and that included your own children. and if you were an informer, you were often amply rewarded by the state, so that if you lived in an overcrowded apartment building with 3 families in the same flat, and you informed on, you know, the woman down the hall that you didn't like, she got shipped off to the old concentration camp, and you got her apartment. And so that was a lovely society, and it only killed about 30 million people between 1919 and 1959. So that's what happens when the archetypal structure gets tilted badly, when people forget that they have a responsibility to fulfill as citizens, as awake citizens who are capable of stating the truth, and the archetype shifts, so there's nothing left of the great father except the tyrant. And let's not have that happen. I mean, the one on the right is really interesting, because consciously or unconsciously, you know, there's Stellan surrounded by what is, for all intents and purposes, fire. You know, he looks like Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty when she shows up at Aurora's christening. You know, she puts her arms up in the air and green fire surrounds her. It's like he's surrounded by fire, and there's Lenin above him, who's like king of the fiery realm, and that's for sure. So I mean, all the terrors that happened in the Soviet Union didn't start under Stalin, they started under Lenin, and Stalin was definitely Lenin's legitimate son, let's put it that way.
You write in the book, there is no faith and no courage and no sacrifice in doing what is expedient. What do you say to those viewers that don't pursue their dreams and are locked in their careers because they are too afraid to take risks and pursue something meaningful?
Well, the first thing I would say is, well, you should be afraid of taking risks and pursuing something meaningful. But you should be more afraid of staying where you are if it's making you miserable. You're paying a price by sitting there being miserable. You might say, well, the devil I know is better than the one I don't. It's like, don't be so sure of that. The clock is ticking.
Yeah,
and if you're miserable in your job now and you change nothing, in 5 years you'll be much more miserable, and you'll be a lot older.
But isn't it a luxury to pursue what is meaningful? Our viewers have mortgages, they have children,
Yeah.
they have payments and loans. It's
Well,
a luxury to pursue because we lack the resources.
Well, I don't remember now, I'm not talking about what makes you happy. It's a luxury to pursue what makes you happy. It's a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It might require sacrifice. If you need to change your job too, let's say you have a family and children and a mortgage, you have responsibilities. You've already picked up those responsibilities. You don't just get to walk away scot-free and say, well, I don't like my job, I quit. That's no strategy. But what you might have to do is you think, well, this job is killing my soul. All right, so what do I have to do about that? Well, I have to look for another job. Well, no one wants to hire me. It's like, okay, maybe you need to educate yourself more. Maybe you need to update your curriculum vitae, your resume. Maybe you need to overcome your fear of being interviewed. Maybe you need to sharpen your social skills. Like, you have to think about these things strategically. If you're going to switch careers, you have to do it like an intelligent, responsible person. That might take you a couple of years of effort to do properly.
We're built for struggle, us human beings. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet. And, you know, people have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You know, you're doing fine in life, and then you get cancer, and then 6 months later you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend. And you develop by contending, and you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do.
It took me a long time to understand what sacrifice meant. Because on the surface of it, especially the way it's acted out, like burnt offerings and that sort of thing, it just seems like, well, it seems so archaic and distant from us that it's not really comprehensible. But
partly from reading Jean Piaget, and Nietzsche for that matter, I started to understand that people often acted out conceptions before they understood what they meant. And we act out a lot of things we don't understand because we're much more complex than we can represent. So we're always acting out things we don't understand. But so there's this idea in Cain and Abel that you have to make sacrifices in order to stay on the good side of God. And so I thought about that practically, say, not so much metaphysically, but practically, and realized that that was equivalent to the discovery of time, of the future, because we do act, and this is a peculiar discovery of human beings, and maybe a consequence of our expanded intelligence, is that we're actually aware of the future, and we actually treat the future as if it's something that you can bargain with. Now, partly it's because the future is other people, and they remember your reputation, they remember your past actions, and if you do someone a favor, then that favor is in some sense stored up in the future. So you could think about the future as a place of judgment about your moral actions, and it's not that far from that to imagining a God who's keeping track of that, or who even is that. But in any case, the idea of sacrifice emerges in the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain and Abel both make sacrifices to God in order to stay on his good side, let's say. And what a sacrifice means is that you give up something of value in the present so that you can improve the future. And that's no different from what we call discipline. It's exactly the same thing. It's just the concretely acted out version of that. And so, the idea basically was that, well, God was in the transcendent heavens. And the first question would be, well, why is that? And it's like, well, if you go out on a really dark night and look up at the sky, you have a sense of what's beyond you, what's transcendent, what's infinite, and so to associate that with the highest of values is a reasonable association, right? From an emotional point of view. So it's not particularly primitive. It's a smart metaphor, or it's a smart intuition that and it's above you. And we tend to think of when you're moving towards an ideal that you're moving up, that you're moving above, you're moving to the mountaintop, right? You're going up, not down. And so it all sits within that same framework. And it's partly because when you go up, like on a mountain, you can see for long distances, right? So all those things are tangled together. So anyways, so the idea is that you have to give up something of value now so that you make the future better. And sometimes it's even something you love now, and that's a good example too, because often the things that stop us from moving forward are our attachments to things that we should no longer be attached to, right? And in fact, you can almost make that definitional. If you're not moving forward in your life, there's a high probability that you have some idea or some mode of action or some habit that you're so in love with that you won't let go of it. So all right, so Cain and Abel make sacrifices, and there's kind of a hint in the story that it's just a hint that Cain's sacrifices are sort of second rate. But in any case, it's ambivalent, hey? But Abel, he just does wonderfully well, and everything works out for him. And everyone knows people like that, And so God accepts his sacrifices, but for some reason he rejects Cain's. And maybe it's the arbitrariness of God, or maybe it's because Cain's heart isn't in the right place when he's making his sacrifices, which is more likely. And so Cain goes and has a chat with God, and he says, basically what he says is something like, how in the world can you possibly justify this universe that you created? You look at me and I'm breaking myself in half trying to adapt and to make things right, and it's not working. And then there's this Abel character, and things come easy to him, and everything is flourishing for him, and so, like, what the hell? And if you don't understand that question, then you're not thinking, because it's very, very frequently the case when a serious catastrophe besets you in life, that you essentially ask exactly that question. What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of the world? How come there's suffering? And it's easy to become resentful and vengeful as a consequence of that. And so you got to think about what state of mind having your sacrifices rejected puts you in, especially when you see someone who's successful, because that's where the jealousy and resentment starts to fester is probably the right word. And so God says to Cain exactly what he doesn't want to hear, which is, well, yeah, okay, but you have made lots of mistakes in your life. So he basically says sin is at your door like a predatory and sexually aroused animal, and you've invited it into your house to have its way with you and produced something creative as a consequence. So you use a sexual metaphor, you know, and so that you've willingly gone down the negative path, and you've allowed that to enter into you and to operate in a creative manner, and you've spun off all these terrible thoughts and this justification for not acting properly, and that's why things aren't going well for you, and so don't lay that at my feet, which is the most brutal possible message he could have got. And so then he leaves the presence of God, let's say, and it says in the story that his countenance fell, which meant he was basically enraged. And so what does he do? He goes out and kills Abel, and then that's a very fascinating idea, because Abel is his ideal, so he kills his ideal. And when you kill your ideal, you're lost. And then he does that to take revenge on Abel, but also to take revenge on God, which I think is extremely interesting and a deep, deep idea. Like these kids who shoot up high schools, for example, you cannot understand what they're doing unless you understand the story of Cain and Abel. You cannot understand what possesses them until you can understand that someone, even someone who doesn't believe, it doesn't matter, it's the psychological state of mind that matters, is they're out for revenge on being itself. And that's why they produce as much mayhem as possible in the shortest period of time. That's why they sacrifice innocent people, because it's much more vengeful and demonstrative to kill innocent people than to kill guilty people, right? Because it's a worse sin, so to speak. And then they kill themselves. And they kill themselves as a final demonstration of their belief in nihilism and the horror of existence. Because you might say, well, why don't they just kill themselves first and save everyone the trouble? You know, and there's narcissism in that too, because they know their names are going to be splashed across the page. That's their notoriety instead of their accomplishment. And of course, the media is unbelievably complicit in that. So when you're talking about motivation for evil, then you have to understand what it is that's driving it, and it is a deep resentment about the structure of being, for being saturated with suffering, but also for rejecting your sacrifices, and that, you know, that produces the bitterness of failure. And I'll stop with this. One of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament is that, and the Jews in the Old Testament, is that they don't take the path of Cain. Every time they're walloped by God, which is like fairly frequently, they say, we must have done something wrong and we have to set ourselves right. And that's an unbelievably heroic attitude, because that's the alternative to cursing fate. It's like you take the responsibility for failure onto yourself. Most people have problems in living. They don't have psychological problems. Very frequently what I'm doing as a therapist is helping people have a life that would work. You know, and you can parameterize that. It's like, what do you need? How about some friends? That people kind of like that. How about an intimate relationship with someone that you can trust, that maybe has a future? That'd be good. How about a career that puts you in a dominance hierarchy somewhere, so at least you've got some possibility of rising, some possibility of stabilizing yourself, and a schedule and a routine, because no one can live without a routine. You just forget that. If you guys don't have a routine, I would recommend, like, you get one going, because you cannot be mentally healthy without a routine. You need to pick a time to get up, whatever time you want, but pick one and stick to it, because otherwise you dysregulate your circadian rhythms and they regulate your mood. A schedule, that's a good thing, man. Your brain will thank you for it. It will stabilize your nervous system. With a bit of a plan, that's a good thing. Strategizing. Make a career plan. Figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth to people. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they want, and sometimes you can give it to them and maybe they'll return the favor. And if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. One of the things that you can, I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too. If you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is. See if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient.
I called the course Personality and Its Transformations, and I think you could think about that as a restatement of the idea of being and becoming. And that's what you are. You're, for whatever that means, you're an entity that both is and is transforming. And there's a rule that goes along with that, by the way, which is don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are. Which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. So you might even think of that as the core of your being. That's a Piagetian idea. It's a Jungian idea as well. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. Now you're also who you are, but on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. And I do think that that's not an arbitrary statement. One of the things that modern universities do dreadfully now is convince their students that value structures are relative, and that's a big mistake. There's a lot of things wrong with that idea, and one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that doesn't include what I just mentioned, which is that's a good moral rule, is you are the thing that is and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people, for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is, that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. And so do that, see what happens. That's a good idea. All right. So it's personality and its transformations, because partly I wanted to talk to you about what you are as a human being and also as an individual, but also what you could become. And that's actually a crucial question in the domains of clinical psychology in particular, because a lot of what you're doing with people as a clinician is trying to figure out who they could become. That's right. You have a problem, your life isn't what it could be. It's like, fine, let's see what it could be like if we changed it. We'll figure out how to change it. That's got to be a negotiated dialogue, right? Because like, I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe we can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, get you out of bed in the morning, because that's at least one of the crucial issues. So you got to specify the goal, and then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. So okay, so in a broader
in a broader context, you can think about this as a more fundamental ontological question. So the one question is how you should act in the world. The other question is, well, what is the world? And that's a complicated problem. This is a scientific answer to that question, and that is that the world is a collection of objective phenomena, and that's a very powerful perspective. And we have a good method for determining what the world is like as a collection of objective phenomena. And that's made us very technologically powerful, and so more power to us and all that, but leaves a question unanswered. And the question is, well, the world isn't just a place of objective phenomena, because it's not a panoply of inert matter. It has living conscious creatures in it, and they're a different order of being. And the fundamental issue for conscious active creatures is not what is the world from an objective perspective, but how it is that you should conduct yourself in the world. And there's a kind of unbridgeable gap between those two domains of inquiry. And I think the reason for that is that the scientific method removes value from its descriptions. That's actually what it does. And so once you're left with value-free descriptions, it's very difficult to extract out a value proposition from them, because that's the scientific method removes the value propositions. You're supposed to be left with only that which is objective, right? And value propositions are in the domain of the subjective. So I think the idea that you can derive what you should be or do from a collection of facts is flawed, A, because collecting the facts themselves gets rid of the value structure, but B, there's an infinite number of facts, and so how are you going to pick which ones should guide you? You can't. You have to do something else. The facts do not tell you what to do with the facts. You need something else to help you figure that out. Well, it's come to me over the years that that's what the narrative cognitive framework does. It's the framework that we use to specify how we should act in the world. And so you could divide the world into the world as it is and the world as perhaps it should be. That gives you some direction, and you need that, and we know this technically, right? You need direction. The reason for that is it's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. So that doesn't seem particularly disputable to me. You could still say, well, what value structure? It's like, okay, fine, that's a good question. But I've thought a lot about that too. So if we're going to adopt a value structure, there's a couple of rules that go along with it. And this is why the bloody postmodernists are wrong, as far as I can tell, is A, it can't just be my value structure, because I'm stuck with you. And we're both stuck with all these other people. And so if I'm going to lay out a value structure, which is a way of interpreting the world, let's say, and there's an infinite number of potential ways of interpreting the world, it's like, yeah, fine, no problem, except that I have to interpret the world in a way that I can use while I'm dealing with you, and while the two of us are dealing with everyone else, and while all of you are dealing with everyone else. And so that's the Piagetian game proposition. If you want to be a popular kid on the playground, you better play games that other people want to play. That's a brilliant observation. And I told you that Piaget was trying to heal the rift between science and religion, and that's one of the things that he did that he thought helped do that. The question is, well, where do moral judgments come from? Well, they emerge as a consequence of consensus, and it's a bounded domain. If we're going to occupy the same space for any length of time, and those are two critical propositions, the same space and a long time, then we have to figure out how to play an iterative game that doesn't spiral downward, hopefully that might even improve, that we both don't object to, because otherwise it's not going to work, right? You'll walk away and play another game, or the game will disintegrate catastrophically. So there's massive social constraint on what constitutes an appropriate frame of reference. So much for the relativist argument. And then there's another issue that's equally relevant, and it's associated with the idea of objective reality to some degree. But that's not exactly correct, because it's not exactly objective reality. Let's say that you and I decide to occupy the same place for some substantial amount of time, and we figured out how to solve the problem of being together. But you and I still have to figure out how to solve the problem of being together in a manner that doesn't make the world object too much,
And it isn't just other people, although that's a huge part of the world. You want them to not object. You may even want them to support you. That would even be better. But you also have to deal with the tendency of matter to object. Because so your mode of being in the world, your interpretive framework, as a description of how you should act, is actually the laying out of a strategy that will produce the ends that it predicts, which are the things that you want. So this is the pragmatist perspective. This was worked out by William James and his people back in the late 1800s in New England, the only genuine brand of American philosophy. And what the pragmatist said is, how do you decide if something's true? The answer is, how the hell can you? You don't know anything. Well, that's true, but that isn't helpful, because there you're stuck with the problem of how to be in the world. Well, so what you do is you lay out a mode of interpretation that has an endpoint. And then you run the mode of interpretation, embodied, right, because you act it out. And if it doesn't produce the outcome, then it's not, well, let's say, true. The claims within it they're not true by the definition of the game itself. So you might say, well, you're a kid on a playground. You want to play a game. One of the implicit demands is that the game is fun. If it's not fun, it's not worth playing. So you play it for a while, and then you see, well, was that fun? If the answer is yes, then you keep playing the game. You say, well, that game it's good enough, it's accurate enough, it's true enough. And so you lay out interpretations in the world, and they're subject to massive constraints. Other people have to go along with them and cooperate with you, because if they don't, then look the hell out, like it's a major, serious, non-trivial constraint. And then the other thing is, well, social proof isn't good enough. It also has to work in the world outside of the social world. So if you have an illness and you have some hypothesis about how to construe it, you might say, well, is my understanding of the illness correct? Well, it implies that I take these actions. Well, how do you know if it's correct? Well, you take the actions, and if the illness gets worse, then by the definitions that are implicit in the framework of reference that you're using, you've made an error. And so there's no relativism in that. You could still say, well, there's a lot of potential solutions to any potential set of problems. It's like, yeah, there's lots of different ways to play chess on a single board. Right, but that doesn't mean that any old solution is as good as any other solution. It doesn't mean that at all. So, okay, so then we're looking at things two ways. We're trying to figure out, well, how does the world present itself, and then how is it that you should act in it? And so, well, there's other constraints on the mechanisms of interpretation that you place in the world. So we could say, well, you're constrained in your interpretations by the constraints that other people place on you. But there's internal constraints as well. We talked about those mostly from a biological perspective, because you could also regard yourself in some sense as a loose internal society. And that's sort of a psychoanalytic dictum, right? You're a collection of sub-personalities, or you could say you're a collection of sub-routines. I don't care how you formulate it, but you're a unity, but you're a unity that brings together a plurality of subcomponents. And part of the constraints on how it is that you lay out your interpretation of the world is that you have to satisfy those internal subsystems, right? So you're the ego, but it's more like you're the captain of a ship full of people who are rowing. You got to keep the people rowing. You're not tyrant. You're not omnipotent tyrant of your own destiny. You're constrained by the nature of your own being. And so you have to provide yourself with food, and you have to provide yourself with shelter, and you have to provide yourself with water, and all of these things. And those are demands that are laid on you by the nature of your internal processes. And of course, how they lay themselves out as demands and what the appropriate solutions to that is, to those problems are, is debatable infinitely. But you can see the constraints stack up. You have to satisfy your internal constraints. So they have to be brought into a unity. That seems to happen, at least in part, between the ages of 2 and something like between the ages of birth and 4 years old, maybe even 2 years old. You bring yourself together into something that's sort of functioning as a unity. Then you have to turn that unity into a unity that can function in the social world with increasing breadth. And that unity in the social world has to be a unity that can function inside the natural world. It's something like that. So you're stacking up these games into a hierarchy of increasing complexity. And one of the questions that emerges from that is, well, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? If it's a hierarchical structure, it has to be a hierarchical structure, because some things have to be worth doing more than others, or you can't act, which is another thing I really don't like about the postmodernist ethos, because It claims that value structures are there to eliminate, to exclude and oppress, and never once notices that, well, yeah, fair enough, but value structures are also there so that you know which way to walk, because you can't figure out which way to walk without saying that that direction is preferable to that direction. So you're stuck with the damn things. And they do exclude. Obviously, category structures exclude. The question is, if you're going to have a value structure, how is it that it should be constituted? Well, I already described some of the constraints. Like if your value structure is perfectly functioning except that you don't get enough to eat, that turns out actually to be a fatal problem, right? And it might be, you can run into all sorts of fatal problems. You're too lonesome. Well, it means let's say that your value structure is too narcissistic. There's lots of reasons to be lonesome, but that might be one of them. Or you're too timid or something like that. Like you're going to be informed by your own internal biological mechanisms when the value structure that you're laying out in the world is insufficient to keep itself propagating across time. And some of that's just you, and some of that's other people, and some of that's the natural world. Constraints galore. And so in the face of all those constraints, it's absolutely unreasonable to say any old solution goes. Just try it. Generate a random solution. Run it as a simulation in the world. And see how many slings and arrows come your way. There'll be plenty. And you might say, well, I don't care about slings and arrows. It's like, yeah, no. That's a claim you don't get to make. So, okay, so you're being informed internally as to the nature of your value structure. You have to specify where you are. You have to specify where you're going. You have to integrate all your underlying biological mechanisms into that schema. It's something I think that's actually kind of weak about the Piagetian ideas, hey? Because Piaget, I'm a great fan of Piaget, but Piaget tended to think that the child came into the world with nothing but a set of reflexes. I mean, that's his technical claim, and that you bootstrap off those reflexes, and I think it underestimates the degree to which the child comes into the world as an already prepared unit. And I mean, he just thought of those things as so self-evident that you don't need to talk about them, but that's actually not true. You do need to talk about them. We know, for example, that if you provide children with food and shelter, and adequate food and shelter, but you don't interact with them socially, almost all of them die in the first year, right? It's not optional. Touch is not optional for children. Attention is not optional for children. Play is not optional for children. So it isn't just like, well, the child comes into the world with a set of reflexes and can adapt to any old environment. It's like, no, the environment has to be structured in a certain way or the child will die. And it's very interesting when it comes to things like play and touch, because you wouldn't think of those as fundamental necessities, right? But it turns out that they are. If you deprive a child badly enough of play and touch in the first 3 years of their life, even if they survive, what comes out at the end of that is often something that's like barely recognizable as a functional human being and cannot be repaired after that point. And that experiment was done with Romanian orphans back in the 90s. So it was an ugly situation, to say the least. Okay, so now you take these underlying biological systems and maybe they aggregate themselves into something that vaguely looks like your temperament, your 5 temperamental dimensions. So maybe if you're an extrovert, you're dominated by the dopaminergic system, just like you are if you're high in openness. And if you're high in neuroticism, it's mostly that you're dominated by anxiety systems and systems that mediate emotional pain. And if you're agreeable, you're dominated by the function of the underlying maternal/care affiliation systems. But so you could say, well, you've got a multitude of fundamental biological predispositions that manifest themselves as implicit stories, something like that, and they organize themselves into the primary temperaments, and the primary temperaments are biasing factors that determine in part the nature of the interpretive structure that you're going to lay out in the world. It's not entirely determined by your temperament. We know that personality is only predicting something like, let's say, 10% of the variance in most complex social outcomes. And the other elements are, well, temperamental as you might be, you still have to get along with other people and the world. So you come in with these internal biases, but they still have to be modified extensively by your social and your natural surround. Okay, and then you develop your routines from the bottom up, as Piaget pointed out, and sometimes from the top down, because now and then you can think yourself into a radical transformation. But mostly what you're doing is building the micro units of your interpretive schemas and your behaviors and aggregating them into higher order structures that you can then tag with higher order abstractions. And we talked about that. You can't tell a 3-year-old to clean up his room. And the reason for that is those are empty boxes as far as the kid's concerned. Clean, he might have room, he might have that. Clean, he doesn't have. He might have pick up the teddy bear and put it in that space, right? So that's one of these little micro routines. And maybe you say, you put 20 of those micro routines together, and now you can say, clean up your room. And basically what you're saying is, implement the 10 micro routines that you've learned. And so a well-functioning personality has all the micro routines in place. That's actually something that you help people with if you're a behavioral therapist, because one of the things you assume if you're a behavioral therapist is that sometimes the reason people aren't doing things is because they don't know how. You know, sometimes maybe the person's depressed but potentially high functioning. They got all the damn micro routines. They're well socialized. They're just dormant. You got to get them awake again and implementing them. But sometimes you get someone in your practice, say, who's just been neglected like you cannot believe, right? The parents never paid any attention to them, or maybe just punished them every time they did something good. That's really fun. And then, you know, they didn't make friends, and so they're really, really vague and poorly articulated. And so then what you do is you work at the bottom of the micro routines and get them to practice building up all these little attributes that they didn't build up. And you know, one of the things you can think about in terms of character development is, so now maybe you understand something about your own personality. You might say, well, what could you do to improve your personality? And the answer is, develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiations. And so you can sort of place yourself on the personality trait distribution. You know, you're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your, you know, your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So you can, I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where, you know, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. And I think you can practice that consciously. It's like, you're hyper orderly. It's, well, get a dog, you know. Dogs, they're messy, horrible things, you know. It's just what you need if you're hyper orderly, because they're going to leave hair everywhere and force you to live with it. There's this idea that philosophers have developed in the last 50 years called performative contradiction. It's like a lie. Normally you think of a lie as, you lie when you say something that you know not to be true. And there's different forms of lies. There's sins of commission, lies of commission, where you literally say something and you know it not to be true. And then there are lies of omission, where you have something to say and you don't. And classically, people have regarded sins of commission more seriously than sins of omission. But sins of omission, they're not nothing. And you know, I've read studies that purport to demonstrate that if you ask people when they're older, you know, what they regret most in their life, it isn't the mistakes they've made, it's the opportunities that presented themselves to them that they never took, right? That's a sin of omission. I think it's an open question. You know, maybe your life would be long enough, even though it's short, maybe your life would be long enough if you took advantage of everything that came your way. Maybe you'd exhaust yourself in the pursuit of that opportunity so that you could be content with the finitude of your mortal existence. If you didn't avoid and hide things in the fog, let's say, that's rule number 3. Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Your own future, all that opportunity. Do not do what you hate. You go to work and you hate it, right? You're forced to do things that you don't want to do, that grate against, not your lack of discipline, right? We have to get that straight, not your immaturity. You have to, if you're resentful, you got to ask yourself, you know, are you just immature?
or are you being tyrannized? No, those are the questions. And the probability that you're immature is very high if you're resentful, but it's also, well, it's the case for everyone, right? It's like, have you fully grown up? It's highly improbable. And well, you know people, you know what they're like, you know yourself, that you're still 13 in some ways. And I can see this in my clinical clients often. It was so interesting watching them talk, because especially if they had been hurt at some point in their life, they would literally, I could see them transform right before my eyes. I saw one woman once who talked to me about a very traumatic experience she had. Her mother put her in a grocery cart, and it was on a hill. And she rolled down the hill in the bloody grocery cart, and it spilled her out. And she ended up in the hospital and under the care of a pretty damn psychopathic nurse. And it really tilted her towards paranoia for the rest of her life. Right? She was so shocked, first of all, that she got hurt, and second of all, that when she went for help, she encountered someone malevolent who actually, what would you say, fed on her pain. She never recovered from that. And then when she was telling me the story, she was like a 55-year-old woman. She was 5. Like everything about her just shifted, like her tone of voice, the set of her face, the voice she used. You could just see that part of her had come to one crash and halt in the out-of-control shopping cart that hit the pavement hard when she was 5 years old. And this hate. There's this idea in the New Testament. It's a very tricky idea. There's one unforgivable sin. People have argued forever about what that is. Because the idea that one of the ideas our culture is based on is that if you've made mistakes in your life, but you admit to them, so that's to confess, let's say, and then you repent, which is to figure out what the hell you did wrong and decide to do better in the future. And that can be very hard if you did something really wrong, so it's not like it's an easy thing to do. It's difficult in proportion to the magnitude of your failure to aim, let's say. But that if you do that properly, no matter how far you've strayed, that you can be set back on the proper path, right? That you can be forgiven and that you can then move ahead. And we better hope that's true, because there isn't anybody anywhere who hasn't done many things that were pretty damn dark. And if it was only the case that we were done when we made a mistake, then, the jig's up for everyone. And so you need justice, because you can't get away with everything or even anything, perhaps, but you need mercy too. And mercy is, well, the same. You apply that to your children as well. They make a mistake or multiple mistakes, and perhaps even more so when they're teenagers. And the basic rule is still, try to do better and you're still welcome, fundamentally. And that's a good rule. That's a really good rule. What would interfere with that process of redemption, let's say, and maybe that's your decision not to abide by the dictates of your own conscience. So you tell yourself, I shouldn't be doing this, whatever it happens to be. Maybe you don't find your job meaningful. And not that that's a simple problem. Or maybe you're really called upon to do things at work or in your family life, or just to save your good name, that really do disturb you, and yet you do them anyway. And then you practice doing that. You make that into a habit, and everything you practice, that becomes you. This is true neurologically. If you repeat something over and over, if you practice it, you build the biological structures that make you an expert at that. And so if you're practicing violating your own conscience with a performative contradiction, this other form of lie, this willingness to act out things that run contrary to your own sense of morality, right? So you act out a lie. Well, then you become the embodiment of a lie. And, well, there's endless metaphorical speculation about the spirit of the lie, right? I mean, that's one of the characterizations of the great adversary of mankind, it's the Prince of Lies. And you allow that to take up its residence within you because you're rationalizing doing what you hate, then you do that at your own peril. And if you get really good at that, maybe there's no way back. The danger of being an actor, you know, is that you become the actor and then you lose you, obviously. You replace you with that falsehood, and that will make you bitter, to lose you in the service of a falsehood. And then, you know, once you're bitter, then you're vengeful. And once you're vengeful, then you're, what's next? Fratricidal. That's Cain, by the way. And once you're fratricidal, the next step is homicidal. And the step past that is genocidal. And, you know, you can walk down all those steps, and people have lots of times. And every one of us has something in us of all of that. That's for sure. And you don't want to practice that. Faith is a presupposition for living in the truth. And then you might ask yourself another question, which is, well, why bother living in the truth? Well, one answer would be so that reality doesn't rise up and smite you repeatedly, which it will if you're deceptive. So that's one answer. But here's another answer, and this is a better answer. People ask themselves all the time, what's the purpose of life? And there's a variety of answers to that. There's no purpose. We're just atoms on a dust mote at the edge of a rather reprehensible corner of the cosmos, and we exist for a moment and we're out, and that's that. Or we're so lost in a plethora of subordinate meanings that we're confused and aimless. Or we want to be hedonistically happy, and I would say that's really the offer that's on the table in our culture most of the time. It's like, well, I just want to be happy. And people will say that to you. It's a slogan. It's the most common slogan of our time, I would say, and it's such a preposterous slogan. It's like, what do you mean just? You just want to be happy. That's all. That's all you want. That absolute impossibility. You want bliss unending, no matter what you do, and that's all you want. It's not exactly a small ask, let's say, because it's the same thing as asking to dwell permanently in paradise. It's something like that. So it's not that likely. And then it also isn't true. That isn't what you want. If you do careful analysis of what people mean when they say they just want to be happy, what they mean is they don't want to suffer stupidly. We're much more concerned with not experiencing an excess of negative emotion than we are with experiencing a surfeit of positive pleasure. So first of all, we don't mean we just want to be happy. We mean, please don't make us too miserable. And fair enough, that's reasonable. But then even on the happiness front, even on the absence of misery front, that's not true. One of the things Dostoevsky pointed out in Notes from Underground, which is so bloody brilliant, he was criticizing the idea of materialist utopia. He said something like, well, imagine we made our materialist utopian dreams come true, and everybody had enough to eat all the cakes they wanted and enough to drink and nothing to do, he said, but busy themselves with the continuation of the species. And we were so pleased that we emitted nothing but bubbles of bliss. He said, human beings were so damn ungrateful that the first thing we do is take a stick and smash up all that comfortable prosperity just so that something unexpected and provocative could happen. And that's very smart. You know, that's hearkening in some sense back to the story of the Garden of Eden and the proclivity of human beings to eat the forbidden fruit. It's like it isn't obvious at all that we want happiness. It isn't even obvious that we want absence of misery. What's really obvious is that we want an adventure, right? We want an adventure that's so compelling that it makes the misery of life not just justifiable, but worthwhile. You want to look back on your life, you know. You want to look back on your life, and you know this to be true. You want to be able to say to yourself, even considering a month or a week or a series of days, you want to be able to say, that was really difficult, but you know what? It was worth it. And I think that's what you want from your life. It's something like, you know what? That was difficult, but it was worth it. And that meant that the adventure was so great that it justified the difficulties. And so then the question is, and here's the question, where do you find the great adventure of your life? Well, how about in truth? Well, why? Because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth. It's a mystery. It's going to lay itself out for you. And so that's an adventure, because you literally do not know what's going to happen. You have to let go of knowing what's going to happen. And so then you have that adventure, and then what is also the case is that it's you that's having the adventure. Right? Because if what you're doing is living in truth, that's you. That truth is you. And so that means that whatever happens when you tell the truth is your adventure. And then you think, well, I'm using deception. It's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe deception is using you. And then maybe it's the spirit of deception that's having the adventure of your life. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are you so miserable and unhappy? And the answer would be, well, the spirit of deception is having the adventure of your life. You're not even there. Because if you're not living in truth, you're not there. Obviously, what's there is the spirit of deception. And you might think that's your deception, but I would be very careful about thinking that, because there have been centuries of meditation on the nature of the spirit of deception. And the answer isn't that the spirit of deception is you. The answer is that the spirit of deception is something that possesses you and convinces you that it's you. And that's not something you want to fall into the clutches of. So now you have to tell me the question again.
I'm certain you answered it. This was about teenagers.
Oh, yes. Well, back to the teenagers. Do you not want to go to college, or are you just lying about being lazy? So that's a question, and we can ask ourselves that question. And as I said, on the teenage front, craft a vision, craft a compelling vision. That's really what we are as human beings, is we're visionaries. That's how we confront the horizon of the future. We meet the horizon of the future by crafting a compelling vision. And your vision might not involve a college education, but it should be a vision that makes you think, if I could make that come true, it would justify the trouble that it would take to manage it. And I think that's the right attitude to take towards your life. And we're all going to have our crosses to bear in the most fundamental manner. We all have to deal with the catastrophe of mortality. And I think we all have to deal with the reality of hell. And you can think about that religiously or not. Political hell will do for hell as far as I'm concerned. We certainly saw no shortage of evidence for that in the 20th century. And we all have to contend with that, right? The reality of mortality and the reality of hell. And then we all have to contend with the fact that we have to develop a vision for our life that is so compelling that it justifies those bitter realities. And that's really the nature of the religious enterprise. And that's something you can embark on and should embark on young. If you're trying to figure out who you are, it's figure out who you need to be in order to justify the catastrophe of your life. And then you think, well, that was difficult. Man, that's for sure. But it was worth it. So, thank you very much. It was very good of all you to come tonight. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Lovely to be here.
That's so nice.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah. Good night.
Why? I was at the Modern Art Museum, Museum of Art in New York. I'm afraid I don't remember which one, unfortunately, but I was in this amazing room. You know, it had all these priceless paintings from the late Renaissance hanging in it. You know, each painting worth, who knows, $1 billion maybe. They're priceless paintings. So the room was, it's a shrine, and it was full of people from all over the world who were looking at these paintings. You think, well, what the hell are these people doing coming to this room looking at these paintings? Like, what are they up to? One of them was a painting of the Assumption of Mary, right? Brilliantly composed. And there was all these people looking at it. And I thought, what are they doing? They don't know what that means. Like, why are they looking at that painting? Why is it in this room? Why does it cost $1 billion? Why is that painting worth so much? And the answer to that is, well, we don't really know. Like, it happened. They're sacred objects in some sense, and we gaze at them in ignorance and wonder. And the reason for that is that the unknown shines through them at us and in partially articulated form. And so, well, that's the role of art. And that's the role of artists, you know? And real artists are contending with the unknown, right? And they're possessed by it. They have a personality trait, openness, that makes them do that. They can't even help it. And I've had lots of creative people in my clinical practice, and I can tell you the worst thing for creative people is to not be creative, because they just die. And because it's like maybe you're a tree with a few major branches, you know? That's your personality. So if you're extroverted, man, you can't be cut off from people because you just wither. And if you're agreeable, you have to be in an intimate relationship or you die, you know? And if you're conscientious, man, and you're unemployed, you're just going to eat yourself up because you have to have a duty and you have to carry a load because you just can't stand it otherwise. And open people have to be creative. They have to be, because otherwise they die. They don't have any vitality. And so they're cursed with the necessity of putting a foot out into the unknown and making sense of it. And then they're also cursed with the necessity of trying to make a living while they're doing that, which they can't, because you can't. It's almost impossible to monetize creative action, as many of you who are creative will no doubt find out. It's very, very frustrating. It's not that creative action is without value, right? Because the creative people are entrepreneurs, and the creative people revitalize cities, and the creative people make things magnificent and beautiful. You think about what's happened in Europe over the last 1,000 years, say 2,000 years, this amazing, unbelievable collaboration to make things so beautiful that they're jaw-dropping when you walk into them. And you think about the economic value of that, right? I mean, I think it's either France or Spain that's the most visited country in the world. It's one of those two. I think there's more tourists in France than there are people most of the time. And part of the reason for that is it's just so damn beautiful. You just can't stand it. And you think, what's the economic value of that? It's absolutely incalculable. And what's interesting too is that you build that beauty in, and then the farther away you get from it in time, the more valuable it becomes, right? Instead of decaying, it has exactly the opposite effect. Its value magnifies. And one of the things that I'm deeply ashamed of as a Canadian is that our sense of beauty is so underdeveloped. We're so primitive. It's not even primitive, that's the wrong word, because, you know, I don't know what it is. It's second rate. It's second rate at least. It's terror too, because people are afraid of beauty. But the idea that art is, the conservatives really have a problem with this in particular, because conservative people tend not to be that creative. And it's a mystery by temperament. It's a mystery to me, because they should be concerned with economic development, and beauty is so unbelievably crucial to economic development that it just yells out at you, you know? So anyway, so that's what artists are doing. And so one of the things I would say is buy a damn piece of art, you know? Find one that really speaks to you, and buy a piece of art, because you invite that into your life, and it's a look out if you do it. If it's a real piece of art, because you'll also get a little introduction to the artist, and then that'll seep into your life, and that'll change things like mad. But it's unbelievably worth it, because it opens your eyes to the domain of the transcendent. That's the right way of thinking about it. A real piece of art is a window into the transcendent. That's what it is. And you need that in your life, because you're finite and limited and bounded, right, by your ignorance and your lack of knowing. And unless you can make a connection to the transcendent, then you don't have the strength to prevail. And that's part of the covenant. That's part of the covenant with God. And you can see that because you look at these magnificent cathedrals that our civilization built over the centuries. You know, some of those, they're still building this Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, right? And it's an amazing building. I think it's going to take them like 300 years to build that. You know, people in the Middle Ages, they'd start building a cathedral and they think, oh, we'll be done this in 300 years. You know, imagine the vision that it took to invest in something like that. We look at quarterly reports. We can't think 300 years into the future to build something of that kind of remarkable, what? Those cathedrals are so, they're perfect, they're trees first, right? They're a forest, right? The Gothic cathedrals, they're a forest, and the sun is shining through the branches. That's the stained glass, and they're the perfect balance of light and structure, because they're representing something about the proper structure of being, which is something like the proper balance between light and structure. And they represent like the sacred tragedy of mankind. That's why they're in the shape of a cross, and they're open to the sky. That's why they have a dome, and they're full of gold so that it glitters, because that's like the city of God, you know. And you can see that integral to our culture is the idea that beauty is one pathway towards God. And it's saying, if you can't find another pathway, then why don't you use beauty? I'm sure most of you do that with music, because music is the one thing that modern people can't be cynical about. Thank God for that. And I've been fascinated by music because of that. It speaks meaning to people, right? Even nihilistic punk rockers are so damn engaged with their music that they can hardly stand it. And you can knock on them and say, look, you know, you're having a transcendent religious experience, and they'll just tell you to fuck off, because that's because that's what punk rockers have to do. But but that's still what's happening, you know. I mean, it's still what's happening. So so I got into all that because I was talking about the Bible as literature, you know, and trying to lay out, because we need in our culture to justify the arts. And you have to, I don't want to do that by talking about high culture, talking about something abstract and evanescent. That's the wrong way to go about it. This is vital. You know, like one of the things that's really interesting about the University of Toronto is that the one side of the campus where we are is beautiful, medieval cathedral, and the other side is god-awful factory. And, you know, and the thing is, the attitude towards knowledge has paralleled that architectural transformation. You know, at one point, the humanities, let's say, were a sacred endeavor, and so was the art of being educated in the university, and that's turned into, like, mass factory, and that's reflected in the architecture. This isn't accidental. None of this happens by random chance, you know. It's not like there's a conspiracy or anything, because there isn't, but that doesn't mean that these things aren't tangled together. And the loss of beauty in the universities is a catastrophe, because without that beauty, there's no call to higher being. You know, this is also why, you know, I've mentioned to people that they should clean up their rooms. That's become quite the internet meme. But I'm really serious about it, because it's really hard to do that. And I've been cleaning up my room, by the way, for about 4 months now, because my life was thrown into such a catastrophe, and also we were renovating. And so, but it isn't just that you clean it up, you also make it beautiful. And it's really hard to make something beautiful. And it's really worthwhile. And what's really cool is if you learn to make something beautiful, even one thing, if you can just make one thing in your life beautiful, then you've established a relationship with beauty. And then you can start to expand that relationship with beauty out into the world, like into other elements of your life. And that is so worthwhile. It's just incredibly, crazily worthwhile. And that's an invitation to the divine. You know, you have to be daring to do that. And people are terrified of it. People are terrified of color. They paint their walls beige. They're terrified of art. They buy some mass-produced thing because they don't want anybody laughing at them for their lack of taste. and they would get laughed at because they have no taste. But you have to, well, it's right, because what do you know, right? You have to develop it, and so you're going to stumble along and make mistakes to begin with, and you're going to show yourself, because if you buy, oh, I think this is pretty, and you know, somebody comes over and goes, hey, what's up with you? It's kind of hard on your self-esteem, but it's you're stumbling towards the right, you're stumbling towards the kingdom of God. That's what you're stumbling towards when you try to make an aesthetic decision and to put something in your life that's beautiful, and it's unbelievably worthwhile to do that. And you have to steer clear of the frauds and the con artists and all of that, and art is full of that, of course, because it's difficult to distinguish between the real thing and the fraud, but it's unbelievably worthwhile. And so back to literature. I'm telling you this partly because I've been thinking a lot about the humanities and the arts. And practically speaking, because I know that artistic types are also entrepreneurial types, they're the same personality types, and so it's very much worthwhile to make an economic and practical case for this sort of thing. You study literature and the humanities so that you can familiarize yourself with the wisdom of our civilization. Man, you should do that, because people have been working on this thing for a long time, and it's rich beyond comparison, so why wouldn't you do that? And you teach yourself to read, and you teach yourself to speak, and you teach yourself to think, and you teach yourself to communicate. And I can tell you, if you can read and think and communicate, you are absolutely 100% unstoppable. And that's another thing that's so interesting about the humanities education that's at the core of the university. It's like there's nothing more economically valuable than teaching people how to articulate themselves and communicate, because they can identify problems, they can formulate solutions, they can negotiate to consensus, they can negotiate on their own behalf or on the behalf of others. It's like there's absolutely no downside to it, except that there's responsibility that goes along with it. But it doesn't matter, because there's no escape from responsibility. You can either take it voluntarily or you can take it involuntarily. Those are your options, but there aren't any other options. And so we need to understand the role of art and literature and stop thinking about it as an option. It's not an option. It's not an option. What is it said? Man does not live by bread alone. That's exactly right. We live by beauty. We live by literature. We live by art. And literally, not metaphorically, we cannot live without it, because life is too dismal and tragic in the absence of the sublime. Something like a general theory of meaning. That's really what I've been working on, I would say, for 35 years, something like a general theory of meaning. And so I'm going to see if I can deliver the whole damn thing in 35 minutes, which I've never really been able to manage, but I've had a lot of practice, so maybe this is the night. So the first thing I want to tell you about is a little bit about how you perceive things, because it's very important to know how you perceive things. And you don't perceive very much, by the way, because, well, there's a lot of the world, way more than you can possibly imagine, and there's not that much of you. And so a lot of information is coming in through a very narrow channel. And it isn't easy, given the fact that all that information exists, it isn't easy to figure out how to narrow that channel so that the information you get is the information that you need. It's information you need that also gives you a grip on the world, right? It has to be practically useful, true and practically useful, something like that. It's a very, 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 very difficult problem to solve. And a lot of it you don't even really solve, because you can't. It's too complicated. You solve it by doing what you're doing right now, for example. So here you are in this unbelievably beautiful building, and I read today a little bit about it, and today it would cost about $1 billion to build this building. And so you're sitting here, and you're all sitting here peacefully, and you're all pointing in the same direction, right? And we're all basically doing the same thing, and we're doing it peacefully, and we can all focus on the same thing, and we had to invest $1 billion for that to be able to happen. And so you think about that, is that part of the way your society solved the problem of the complexity of the world for you was by investing $1 billion in what, how long did it take to construct this place? 15 years, something like that. Maybe it was longer. So that you could sit here in relative comfort and peace and tranquility and concentrate on something that's very focused, maybe something of beauty, something of artistic merit, something of intellectual merit, and that the rest of the world wasn't there, so you didn't have to worry about it.
And that's not all. It's not just that you're here in this building and the chairs aren't falling apart and the floor is reliable and the electrical lights work and the sound quality is good and like all the technology is working and there's people beetling away in the background like mad constantly everywhere, making sure that those impossible things keep happening so that you don't have to be distracted. But then you're also sitting with people who are roughly like you, roughly like you enough so that when they come into a venue like this, they know enough to sit down in the seats and face forward and not turn around and look at the person behind them, which would make them very nervous, right? Which would be an indication that that person isn't playing the same game as everyone else, and so God only knows what they're up to, because you just wouldn't want that, right? You wouldn't want the guy in front of you turning around and just looking at you for the next 90 minutes. And, well, it's worth thinking about why. Like, well, what are you thinking about? You're going to be sitting there looking like this. Your eyes are going to be darting around, and maybe you're going to be nudging someone and, pointing at this person because maybe they have some idea of what this person is up to, because you don't. And the problem is, if you don't know what that person is up to, then they could be up to anything. And anything is a lot of things to be up to. And you don't want people to be up to anything. You want them to be up to the one or two things they're supposed to be up to while they're with you in this narrow place that you occupy, right? And that's sort of the hallmark of a civilized and socialized person, is when we interact under 90% of conditions, 99% of conditions, you show me your persona. It's just a very narrow slice of yourself, and I show you mine at the bank, say, or at the grocery store, when we pass each other casually in the street. We nod and say hi, and you nod and say hi, or we just walk by peacefully, and like we're seething with complexity, and we don't let any of that out. And the reason for that is we don't want anybody else to let any of it out either. Right? So we keep ourselves simplified, and we build our architecture for that. And so, you come into a building like this, and the building tells you what to do. The chairs are all aligned. The chairs say, sit on me, right? The chairs are all facing the same way in kind of a semicircle, and they say, face the stage. And there's a stage. And so you come in here and all the perceptual problems are solved. And so there's all this technology and there's all this expense, and then there's the shared culture that enables you to know that this is something like a theatrical experience. And so what you do at a theatrical experience is come together as a group and remain silent but attentive, participating in that manner, and watch and listen to the main performance. And you all know that. It's part of the shared culture. And so that shared culture is also enabling you to perceive what you're perceiving right now as a protective mechanism. And that's part of a broader shared sense of civilization, and it's dependent on a shared government. And then there's other forms of protection, Well, the sun isn't shining on us too brutally because we have a roof, and we're not in danger of warfare because you have borders, and you have an armed forces, and you have policemen, and it's like, Christ, there's just things going on around you like mad to ensure that you can sit here so peacefully and so much as if the world isn't a complex place for an hour and a half and do something this focused. And so that's partly how you solve the perceptual problem. You don't see the world that much. You screen a lot of it out. Now, there's a good illustration of this. A psychologist named Dan Simon did this famous experiment which he called Gorillas in Our Midst. And some of you know about it, but I'm going to go over it because it's such a fun experiment to talk about, because it's so ridiculous and so illuminating, and because it's so relevant to what I want to continue talking to you about. So here's the deal. You go into Dan Simon's lab. He was at Harvard 20 years ago when he did this, and he was interested in this phenomena called change blindness. You see those kids' books sometimes where there's picture 1 and picture 2, and you're supposed to look at picture 1 and then look at picture 2 and see what's changed. It's actually hard. You look at picture 1, you say, well, I saw that. And then you look at picture 2, and it's different, but you can't see the differences. And you have to really compare back and forth before you can check out the differences. And that's what perception is like, is you're very blind to change, way more than you think. And way more than anybody thought before Simon did his experiments. And so he did this crazy experiment. So here's the setup. Video camera set up in front of a elevator bank, right? And so the camera would be here, the elevator bank would be about here, so you know it's pretty close-up shot. There's 6 people participating, 3 of them dressed in black, 3 of them dressed in white. The white team has a basketball, the black team has a basketball. They fill the whole screen, so it's not like they're way over in the corner this high and you can barely see them. They fill up the whole screen. You can detect their facial figures. It's close shot. You see their whole body, but it's clear. There's no tricks in it. And you sit there and you're the experimental subject, and the psychologist or his assistant says, okay, here's your task. And you're there to be focused on a task, apparently, because you're in a university and you're in a lab and you'd expect to be focused on a task. And so you're already primed for that and you're willing to go along with it, to be obedient. But to be a good sport, let's say, that's better than obedient. And you want to do a good job because it's intimidating to be in a lab like that. And so you want to do a good job of whatever you're supposed to do. Unless you're a troublemaker, and you're probably not, because you wouldn't go into the lab to begin with if you were a troublemaker. So Simon says, count the number of times, like the white team is going to throw a basketball back and forth, variety of ways, for 3 minutes. Just count how many times they manage it, and they're going to bounce it and throw it directly and all that. And so the black team and the white team start to mill around on the video, and they're tossing the basketball back and forth, and you're watching the basketball very intently with the central part of your vision. Now, the central part of your vision is very high resolution, and you can tell this. It's pretty easy. I'll show you. I don't know. No, this probably won't work because I think the theater is too big to do it. But we could try it, I guess. So look at my finger, all right? But pay attention to my face. Now that's hard because usually when you pay attention to something, you look right at it. But I don't want you to do that. I want you to pay attention to my finger and look at my face. And what should happen, except perhaps for those of you who are quite a distance at the back, is that you'll notice that you actually can't see my facial features. So for example, if I look at even somebody in the 3rd row, if I look directly at you, I can see your facial features fine. I can tell you have glasses. I can't tell if you're male or female. I can't distinguish you from the chair, and it has nothing to do with you. Right. But you don't have to move very far away from central vision before it becomes extremely low resolution. And so that's how your visual system is set up. High resolution in the middle, low resolution as you move towards the periphery, until like out here, I actually can't tell how many, I know how many fingers I have. Well, 5 if you include the thumb, but I can't see them. If I move them, I can see them better. Because that's one of the ways your visual system overcomes its limitations, is that it's better at seeing movement than things that are stable. And that's because, well, if you're watching something and something suddenly moves, off to the right, it might be a good idea for you to shift your attention just to see what it is. And so that's a trick your visual system uses. But mostly it's foveal vision, and it's a very, very small part of your visual field, and it's extremely heavily neurologically innervated in the visual cortex. A lot of cells are devoted to that tiny area in the middle of your vision to make it as high resolution as possible. And it might be nice. Eagles have 2 fovea, by the way. They can see better than human beings. Their eyes, bald eagles, their eyes are as big as human beings, and they can see better than we can. They're the only animals that can do that. They have 2 fovea. But you can't have that high resolution vision across the entire span of your eyes, because then your head would have to be this big to carry that much brain around, and obviously that would be hideous and also counterproductive. So we do the best we can, and what it means is that we're blind to a lot of things that we don't think we're blind to. So anyways, so you're playing Dan Simon's game, and you're counting the number of times that the basketball is tossed back and forth between the white team, and he says how many times, and you say, being a good experimental participant, you say 16. And you're right, and he says you're right, and you think, oh, good, I'm smart enough to participate in a psychological experiment. And you feel good about yourself, It's a little self-respect boost, let's say, because you passed the test. And then Simon says, did you see anything out of the ordinary? And you say, most of you, some people notice, most of you say, no. What do you mean? And Simon says, well, the gorilla. Did you see the gorilla? And you think, well, what do you mean, did I see the gorilla? Like, there was no damn gorilla. I'd see a gorilla, right? If we're watching me on stage and a gorilla came out here, you'd see it. Maybe, as it turns out. It might depend on what the gorilla was doing. But in any case, so Simon rewinds the tape as you watch it so that there's no tricks, and he says, don't count the balls this time, just watch. So it's a different command, right? So you have a different aim now. You're pursuing a different value structure. He says, just watch. And he rewinds it, and sure enough, you see the gorilla coming out backwards and being in the middle and then going off to the side. And then he replays it for you. And minute and a half into the 3-minute video, in waltzes this damn gorilla. It's a guy, because they didn't have a gorilla for obvious reasons. Ethics committees wouldn't allow them to use a real gorilla. And he's a big guy. He's not a small chimpanzee-type ape. He's 6'4", and he saunters out there and beats his chest like for 4 seconds, right in the middle of the screen, which you might think you'd see since it's right in the middle of the screen, and then he saunters off to the side, and you don't see it. And the question is, well, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, why don't you see it? And it's worse than that. Like, Simon has done other funny tricks. Like, imagine you went to a grocery store and the cashier was behind the counter, right? And you're talking to the cashier, and the cashier says, excuse me for a minute, and then kneels down, and then someone else stands up and keeps talking to you. And you think, oh, you're going to catch that. And you don't. About 50% of people miss that completely. So you can like change the person completely. And the reason is, well, how much processing do you have to do to have a casual interaction with a cashier at a grocery store? And the answer is, not much, right? You don't have to do the processing doesn't have to be that deep. And you can kind of tell this because you can watch The Simpsons, or you can watch South Park, and South Park has like the world's worst animation, right? I mean, everything moves like this. It's all circles and triangles, and you don't care. It's like 5 minutes into the narrative. It doesn't matter that it's circles and triangles having a conversation. It's fine. The icon will work. And that's a good rule for perception, is you use the simplest possible perceptual scheme that you can manage to get yourself from point A to point B, right? It's a map. You don't see the world. You see an iconic representation of the world. And then the question is, what makes the iconic representation sufficient? And I suppose sufficient means a couple of things. One thing it means is tolerable, right? It doesn't cause an excess of suffering and degeneration. It has to be functional, right? And then maybe a more specific example of that would be, well, it has to work, like a map works. A map is a low-resolution representation, but it's a good enough map if you use the map and you start at point A and you happen to be at point A, which is a good beginning for a map, and then you use the map and you get to point B, and you think, good enough map. And that's really, that's us. That's how we think. That's how we construe the world. Our maps are really, the stories that we use in the world are really the maps we use to guide us. And then they have perceptual implications. But that's essentially what you do. So now the question is, all right, what happened in the gorilla video? Well, what happened was you were aiming at something, right? You were aiming at counting the passes. And the question is, well, why were you doing that? And the answer is, well, someone told you to, asked you to. And then you might ask, well, why did you listen to them? There's lots of other things you might have done in the lab, but that isn't what you did. You did what you were asked to. And we might say, well, that's because you're reasonably cooperative and civilized. And then we might say, well, why is that a hallmark of cooperation and civilization? And we might say, well, reciprocity, like spontaneous reciprocity between strangers who have a bit of a contractual arrangement is part of civilized behavior, and so that's the appropriate thing to do. And we might say, well, you wanted to do a good job in the lab because you wanted to make sure that your status wasn't too low. You know, you could count to 16, and so you can give yourself a pat on the back of the head for that. And, you know, it's part of being a civilized person. And so there's a huge value structure behind that. Like, you didn't go into the lab and shoot it up, you know? You didn't bring a hand grenade, right? And you didn't sexually assault the experimenter. There's lots of things you could have done in there. And you didn't do those things. You just sat there and counted the balls and missed the gorilla. Okay, so, and there's complicated reasons for that. There are deep reasons for that. And so there are deep reasons for how you perceive things and why.